Berlin. Winter, 1944. The Reich Air Ministry sat beneath a gray sky that had not cleared in days. Inside, past corridors of officers, moving with the particular urgency of men who have begun to sense, though not yet admit, that the walls are closing in, a document was placed on a desk. It was not a battlefield report. It contained no account of troop movements or artillery positions. It was something quieter, and in its quietness far more devastating. It was a set of figures, production figures, American production figures. Men like General Georg Thomas had been wrestling with figures like these for years. Thomas headed the Wehrmacht's War Economy and Armaments Office, a department whose entire purpose was to translate the cold arithmetic of industrial capacity into strategic reality. He was not a frontline commander. He was something rarer and, in the end, more consequential, a man whose job was to understand what the numbers meant. And what these numbers meant, he had understood earlier than almost anyone else in the German High Command. The man who now received this latest report did not speak for a long time after he had finished reading. What the document described was not a nation that had been drawn reluctantly into war and was struggling to find its footing. What it described was an industrial civilization that had been waiting, perhaps without knowing it, for exactly this moment. A civilization so vast, so organized, so materially endowed that the act of turning it toward war production was less a transformation than an unleashing. The numbers on those pages were not predictions. They were not projections based on optimistic assumptions. They were confirmed outputs, verified by German intelligence through multiple channels. Aircraft built and delivered, ships launched and crewed, tanks rolling off assembly lines at a pace that would have seemed, just years earlier, like the fantasy of a propagandist. The officer who read that document, whoever he was, whatever he believed before that moment, knew, in a way that he may never have been able to fully articulate to his superiors, that something had changed. Not on the battlefield, not in the strategy rooms of the Wehrmacht. Something had changed in the nature of the war itself. This is the story of that realization, of how Germany came to understand, too late, and never completely, what it had awakened when it forced the United States into the Second World War. To understand the German assessment of American industry, we must first understand why such a document would need to exist at all. In a rational world, in a world governed purely by the arithmetic of industrial capacity and military potential, there would have been no need to assess what everyone should have already known. The United States was, by almost any measurable standard, the most productive industrial nation on Earth by the late 1930s. Its steel output dwarfed Germany's. Its automobile industry had no peer. Its railroad network, its coal reserves, its petroleum production, all of it pointed toward an economic machine of extraordinary scale. And yet Germany went to war in a way that treated America as a peripheral concern, not because the German leadership was entirely ignorant of these facts, but because of something more complicated, a mixture of ideological conviction, strategic wishful thinking, and a deeply rooted cultural assumption about what American power actually meant in practice. The Germans knew the numbers. They did not believe the numbers translated into military effectiveness. This is the first thing the secret assessment had to confront. Not ignorance, but the gap between knowing something and truly reckoning with it. The documents that collectively form what historians have come to understand as Germany's wartime economic intelligence on the United States were not the product of a single office or a single moment. They emerged from multiple sources: the military economic planning staffs of the Wehrmacht, the intelligence branches of the Reich Economic Ministry, the Luftwaffe's own production analysis units, and the reports of German agents and diplomats who had spent time in America before the war, severed those connections entirely. What these documents shared, what gave them a common texture, a common set of anxieties, was the growing recognition that the assumptions built into German war planning in 1941 were not holding. The war was supposed to be won before American industry became relevant. That was the plan, or rather, that was the hope dressed in the language of a plan. The conquest of the Soviet Union was meant to be swift. Britain was meant to be isolated, perhaps compelled toward a negotiated peace. And America, even if it entered the war, would find itself facing a consolidated European power that had already won its decisive campaigns. By 1943, none of that had happened, and so the assessments began in earnest. Serious, meticulous, thorough, the way German military bureaucracy always worked when it finally turned its full attention to a problem. The question they were trying to answer was not abstract. It was urgent, and it was specific. Could American production be countered? Could the output of American factories be degraded through submarine warfare, through strategic calculation, through some combination of attrition and technology that would neutralize the advantage before it became decisive? To answer that question, the assessors had to first describe the thing they were trying to counter. And in describing it, they were forced to confront truths that the earlier, more optimistic strategic calculations had papered over. What follows is, in essence, a reconstruction of what those assessors found and what it meant. There is a particular kind of error that emerges not from a lack of information, but from an excess of ideology. The German underestimation of American industrial power in the years leading up to and immediately following Pearl Harbor was precisely this kind of error. The data was available. The conclusions were drawn wrong anyway. Adolf Hitler's personal views on the United States were a tangle of contempt and grudging acknowledgement that never fully resolved themselves into coherent strategy. He was aware that America had tipped the balance in the First World War. He was aware that Henry Ford, a man he reportedly admired, had built an industrial empire that Europe could not match. He understood, in some abstract sense, that America was large and productive, but he also believed, with a conviction that ran deeper than evidence, that America was racially and politically too fractured to translate that productivity into effective military power. This was not merely Hitler's personal quirk. It was a view widely shared in the upper echelons of the Nazi regime and, to a lesser but still significant extent, in the professional military leadership. America was seen as a nation of immigrants, a mongrel civilization, in the ugly language of Nazi racial theory, without the cultural cohesion necessary to sustain a prolonged war effort. Its political system, with its open debates and its press and its labor unions and its fractious Congress, was viewed as a structural weakness. A democracy, the German theorists argued, could not mobilize with the speed and discipline that total war required. Underlying all of this was a specific reading of American history. The United States had not fought a major war on its own soil since 1865. Its military in the 1930s was genuinely small. At the time of the Munich crisis, the American army ranked 17th in the world by size, smaller than that of Romania. The equipment was aging. The doctrine was outdated. The officer corps was spread thin across a peacetime establishment that had no reason to expect the demands that were coming. Germany's military planners were not wrong to note these things. They were wrong to assume that they were permanent features rather than temporary conditions. The gap between a peacetime military and a wartime one is not fixed. It is bridgeable, given time and resources. And what Germany failed to fully appreciate was that America had both in abundance. The cultural contempt also had a specific geographic dimension. America was, from the German perspective, absurdly far away, across an ocean, protected by thousands of miles of water that no European power could cross in force. This was understood as a weakness, a nation that had grown soft behind its natural walls, that had no real experience of what war meant when it came to the doorstep. What the German planners did not adequately weigh was the inverse, that those same walls protected American factories from any direct threat, giving American industry a security that German industry, under RAF bombing from 1940 onward, could only dream of. There was also, embedded in the underestimation, a failure to understand what the American private sector had become by the late 1930s. Germany had its great industrial concerns, IG Farben, Krupp, Thyssen, and they were formidable. But they operated within a system that was, by American standards, relatively centralized and bureaucratically encumbered. American industry had spent the 1920s and 1930s in a ferocious competition that had produced, as its byproduct, an extraordinary refinement of mass production techniques. The automobile industry above all. Ford's River Rouge complex was not just a factory. It was a demonstration of a principle that with sufficient investment in tooling and process design, almost any complex product could be manufactured at previously unimaginable scale and speed. Germany knew about River Rouge. German engineers had visited it. Reports had been written. But knowing about something and truly understanding its implications are different things. The implications, when they finally became undeniable, would arrive in the form of the production figures on that winter desk, and they would be staggering. Numbers in isolation can be meaningless. They require context. They require comparison. And when the German assessment teams began assembling the verified production figures from American industry in 1942 and 1943, the context that made those numbers intelligible was not encouraging. Consider aircraft. In 1939, the United States produced roughly 2,000 military aircraft. This was not an impressive number. Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union all exceeded it. But between 1939 and the end of 1941, American aircraft production began to accelerate in a way that had no precedent. By 1942, the first full year of American belligerence, the United States produced nearly 50,000 military aircraft. In 1943, the figure climbed again. In 1944, it reached its peak. Nearly 100,000 military aircraft in a single year, from fighters to bombers to transports, built in factories spread across the American continent. The Luftwaffe's production analysts, reviewing these figures, faced a mathematical problem that had no tactical solution. Germany, under the direction of Albert Speer's armaments ministry, performed remarkable feats of reorganization and efficiency, increasing production dramatically even as Allied bombing intensified. But the German aircraft industry was working within hard constraints: limited aluminum, limited skilled labor, limited factory space that was increasingly under attack. Its peak annual production, achieved in 1944, was roughly 40,000 aircraft. Impressive, but less than half the American output produced while German factories burned. The disparity in shipbuilding was, if anything, even more disorienting. The German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic was predicated on a calculation that submarines could sink Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. In 1942, the calculation seemed, briefly, to be working. U-boats sank an enormous tonnage of Allied shipping, and for several months the rate of sinkings did indeed outpace replacements. But American shipbuilders, and in particular the shipyards organized under Henry Kaiser's direction, were in the process of transforming the production of ocean-going vessels in a way that the German naval planners had not anticipated. Kaiser's innovation was the application of assembly line principles to shipbuilding. Rather than building a ship from the keel up, one piece at a time, Kaiser's yards prefabricated sections of hull in separate facilities and then welded them together at the final assembly point. The results were astonishing. In the early months of the program, a Liberty ship, a standardized cargo vessel of about 14,000 tons displacement, took roughly 230 days to complete from keel laying to delivery. By late 1942, Kaiser's yards had brought this down to under 2 weeks for some vessels. The record, set as a deliberate demonstration, was 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes from keel to launching. These were not propaganda figures. They were documented, verified, observed by neutral parties. And when German naval intelligence compiled them, alongside the data showing that American yards were launching new vessels at a rate that utterly overwhelmed the U-boat campaign's capacity for destruction, the conclusion was inescapable. The submarine strategy, which had represented Germany's best available tool for degrading American productive power before it could reach the European theater, had failed. Not failed because German submarines were poorly designed or poorly crewed. They were neither. It had failed because the gap between the destruction they could inflict and the production they were trying to stop was simply too large to close. Tank production followed a similar trajectory, though the comparison is somewhat more complicated given the Soviet Union's own extraordinary output. What mattered for the German assessment of America specifically was not merely volume but the systemic nature of American production. The M4 Sherman tank, which became the primary American armored vehicle, was not the best tank on the battlefield by the technical standards of its era. The German Panther and Tiger tanks were superior in armor and armament on a one-to-one basis, and German engineers and crews knew it. But the numbers behind this comparison reveal something that tactical assessments alone could not capture. A Tiger tank, formidable, feared, technically extraordinary, required in the region of 300,000 man-hours to manufacture from raw materials to completed vehicle. The Sherman required a fraction of that. The precise figure varied by production run and facility, but the ratio was sufficiently large that for every Tiger that came off a German production line, American factories could produce multiple Shermans, and often did, with capacity to spare. This was not an accident of scale. It was the direct consequence of the design philosophy embedded in the Sherman from its conception. The tank had been engineered not merely to fight, but to be built quickly, maintained easily, and replaced cheaply. Every component decision, the welded rather than cast hull sections where possible, the radial aircraft engine repurposed for tank use because it was already being mass-produced in enormous quantities, the standardized track and suspension that could be serviced by mechanics who had never seen a tank before the war, reflected a coherent industrial logic that German tank design, for all its engineering brilliance, simply did not share. The German assessment teams understood what this meant, even when their superiors were reluctant to hear it. The war was not being fought on the terms that German strategy had assumed. It was not a contest of technical excellence, in which superior engineering could neutralize a quantitative disadvantage. It was becoming a war of replacement rates, of stockpiles, of the ability to absorb losses and continue operating. And on those terms, America had no peer. Ammunition and logistics completed the picture. American factories produced artillery shells, small arms ammunition, aviation fuel, military clothing, food rations, communications equipment, and thousands of other categories of military supply at volumes that, combined, created a logistical flow of almost incomprehensible scale. American soldiers in the field were the best supplied soldiers in the history of warfare, not always the best trained. Not always the most experienced in the opening months of a campaign, but never without food, never without ammunition, never without the material means to continue fighting. The logistical apparatus behind the American military, the depots, the shipping, the trucking, the repair facilities, was itself a weapon invisible but decisive. There was a question that German strategic planners returned to repeatedly, with a kind of desperate persistence. Could the American industrial machine be physically attacked? Could its output be disrupted at the source? The answer, worked out with meticulous care in the assessment documents, was effectively no. And the reasons were geographic in the most fundamental sense. American industry in the 1940s was spread across a continent of nearly 10 million square kilometers. The great manufacturing centers, Detroit and its surrounding region, the steel cities of Pennsylvania and Ohio, the shipyards of the Gulf Coast and the Pacific, the aircraft plants of California and Kansas and Texas, were separated from each other by distances that dwarfed the entire theater of operations in Western Europe. To attack any meaningful fraction of this dispersed industrial base simultaneously would have required an air force and a delivery capability that no nation in the world possessed, let alone Germany. The Luftwaffe had been designed as a tactical air force, built to support ground operations, to achieve air superiority over a battlefield, to interdict enemy logistics at the operational level. It had strategic bombing theorists within its ranks, but the aircraft it had built, the Heinkel He-111, the Junkers Ju-88, the Dornier Du-17, were medium bombers with limited range and payload compared to the long-range heavy bombers that would be required for a true strategic campaign against distant industrial targets. Germany had no aircraft equivalent to the American B-17 or B-29. It had attempted to develop one in the form of the Heinkel He-177, but the program was plagued by technical difficulties and never produced an aircraft capable of strategic bombing at continental range. There was, however, a more ambitious and more revealing failure hidden within this problem, one that the assessors could not have ignored. As early as 1938, even before the war had begun, elements within the Luftwaffe's planning staff had begun discussing what they called the Marika bomber, a long-range strategic bomber explicitly designed to strike the continental United States. The concept envisioned an aircraft capable of flying from bases in Europe or the Azores, crossing the Atlantic, bombing New York or industrial targets in the American Northeast, and returning. It was, in its ambition, a recognition of exactly what the assessors later confirmed in their reports, that American industry, untouched on its home soil, was the decisive strategic problem. Several German aircraft manufacturers, Heinkel, Junkers, Messerschmitt, and Focke-Wulf among them, submitted designs. Some were technically innovative. None came close to operational reality. The engineering challenges were immense, the resource requirements prohibitive, and the timeline incompatible with the demands of a war that was already underway. The America bomber program quietly died in the planning files, never producing a flying prototype capable of the mission. But its existence is telling. It means that Germany's own planners understood, at least in aspiration, that reaching American factories was the only real solution to the problem those factories represented. The fact that they could not achieve it, could not even come close, was itself a measure of the gap between what Germany needed and what Germany could do. This was not merely a question of aircraft types. It was a question of bases. To bomb American factories, the Luftwaffe would have needed bases within range of the American continent, and there were none. The Atlantic Ocean was not a gap to be bridged, it was an absolute barrier to German air power. The U-boat bases on the French Atlantic coast were within range of Britain, at the extreme edge. They were not within any imaginable range of Pittsburgh or Detroit or Long Beach. The German assessment teams recognized all of this clearly. Their internal documents from this period contain a certain tone of frustrated precision, the language of analysts who are working very hard to find a solution and keep arriving at the same answer. There is no solution, not of this kind. The other side of the geographic equation concerned raw materials. American industry did not have to import the essentials of its production from sources that could be interdicted. The United States had within its own borders, or in secure supply lines from neighbors, it could not be separated from, essentially, everything that modern industrial production required. Iron ore from the Mesabi Range, coal from Appalachia, oil from Texas and Oklahoma and California, copper from Arizona and Montana, aluminum ore, timber, rubber from Latin America via sea lanes that German submarines never came close to controlling for long enough to matter. The contrast with Germany's own supply situation, dependent on Swedish iron ore, Romanian oil, and a cobbled-together network of occupied territories that required constant policing, was stark. Germany could be strangled. It almost was. American industry could not be strangled by any means available to Germany, and the assessment teams were honest enough with themselves, at least in their internal documents, to say so. There is a concept that runs through the German assessments of American production like a thread through a garment, sometimes visible, sometimes buried, but always present. It is the concept of the American approach to manufacturing itself, the philosophy that underlay the numbers. Germany's industrial culture in 1939 was still shaped by a tradition that valued craftsmanship, precision, and engineering excellence above all other considerations. German machine tools were the finest in the world. German optical equipment, German instruments, German ball bearings, German chemical processes, all were characterized by an insistence on quality that approached something close to aesthetic principle. This was not mere vanity. It produced military equipment of genuinely exceptional performance. The German 88mm anti-aircraft and anti-tank gun was acknowledged by friend and foe alike as the finest weapon of its type. German optical sights were clearer and more precise than anything their opponents fielded. The engineering that went into German tanks, aircraft, and submarines was at the level of individual technical achievement, often superior to Allied equivalents. But German production culture had a shadow side that the circumstances of a total war exposed mercilessly. The insistence on quality created bottlenecks. The reliance on skilled craftsmen made production rates hostage to the availability of those craftsmen. The tendency to improve and modify designs continuously, to incorporate the latest engineering insights, into each successive production batch meant that standardization was perpetually sacrificed on the altar of technical refinement. German factories produced weapons that were, individually, magnificent. They could not produce them in sufficient numbers, fast enough, to meet the demands of a war fought at continental scale against multiple great powers simultaneously. American production culture operated on fundamentally different principles. These principles had been formalized and refined over decades of industrial competition, from the interchangeable parts experiments of the early 19th century through the assembly line revolution of Henry Ford and his contemporaries. The American approach could be summarized, at the risk of oversimplification, in a single word: standardization. Build a design that is good enough, then freeze it. Then build it in the largest possible quantities with the simplest possible processes, using the widest possible range of available labor. Good enough is a phrase that German engineers, in a different context, might have treated as an insult. But in the context of a total war, it was a devastating strategic advantage. A tank that is 90% as effective as the enemy's best tank, but is available in 5 or 10 times the quantity, is not a 90% solution. It is an overwhelming solution. The mathematics of the battlefield, as the German assessment teams worked through them with increasing anxiety, consistently produced the same result. Quantitative advantage at a sufficient ratio overwhelms qualitative advantage in almost all circumstances. The American approach also had profound implications for logistics and repair. Standardized parts meant that a damaged vehicle could be repaired with components taken from another vehicle of the same type, or from a supply depot thousands of miles away, with no custom fitting required. It meant that maintenance could be performed by soldiers with limited mechanical training because the processes were simple and the parts were interchangeable. It meant that a crippled Sherman tank could be back in the field in hours, while a disabled Tiger might require weeks of specialized attention and the delivery of bespoke components from factories in Germany. The repair rate was itself a multiplier on productive capacity. American industry was not merely replacing its losses with new production. It was recovering and returning to service a substantial fraction of damaged equipment that, in a less logistically sophisticated force, would have been written off entirely. The German analysis recognized this as a qualitative feature of American military power that went beyond the raw production numbers, a force that was not merely large but inherently resilient, capable of absorbing punishment and reconstituting itself at a pace that German operational planning could not reliably account for. There was something else embedded in the American industrial approach that the German assessors found difficult to fully articulate but clearly sensed: the decentralization of expertise. In Germany, knowledge was concentrated in the engineering offices of great firms, in the hands of master craftsmen who had spent years in their trades. In America, the assembly line had distributed knowledge differently. The goal was to design processes so thoroughly that a worker with weeks of training could perform them reliably. This required more engineering thought up front, a more complete and rigorous analysis of each production step, but it meant that the skilled labor constraint that plagued German industry was far less binding in America. Women who had never worked in a factory before 1941 were assembling aircraft components within months. Former automobile workers were welding ship hulls. The workforce was being continuously expanded and trained against a production system that had been designed from the outset to accommodate them. Understanding production figures is one thing. Truly reckoning with what they mean, allowing them to change your strategic calculations, your sense of what is possible, your assessment of where the war is going, is something else entirely. And it is here that the story of Germany's industrial intelligence becomes most human and most tragic. The German military and political leadership were not stupid men. The generals of the Wehrmacht had, in the campaigns of 1939 through 1941, demonstrated operational brilliance of the highest order. The staff officers who compiled the American production assessments were, in the tradition of the German General Staff, trained to think rigorously and honestly about the military situation. And yet the conclusions toward which their analysis consistently pointed were conclusions that the political structure of the Nazi regime and the particular psychology of its leadership made it nearly impossible to act upon. Albert Speer, who became Reich Minister of Armaments in early 1942 and oversaw the extraordinary rationalization of German war production that followed, understood the problem with considerable clarity. His post-war memoirs and the records from his interrogations by Allied intelligence after the war reveal a man who grasped, perhaps better than almost anyone else in the German leadership, the dimensions of what they were facing industrially. Speer had visited American factories before the war. He had seen, with his own eyes, what the American system looked like in operation. And when he became responsible for German production, he fought with considerable success, but ultimately within limits he could not overcome, to apply analogous principles to German industry. But Speer was an administrator, not a strategist. He could rationalize production. He could not change the fundamental arithmetic of the situation or persuade the leadership to adjust its strategic ambitions to match its industrial realities. Hitler's response to the production assessments when they were placed before him was characteristically complex. He did not simply dismiss them. He was, in his own way, acutely aware of the economic dimensions of the conflict. His table talk conversations are full of references to the productive capacities of various nations, to the importance of raw materials, to the economic underpinnings of power. But his awareness existed alongside a persistent faith in several countervailing possibilities that he was never fully able to let go. One was the faith in decisive new weapons. The V-weapons program, the V-1 flying bomb, and V-2 ballistic missile represented, in Hitler's mind, a potential equalizer. If German technology could develop a weapon that Allied production could not counter, the numerical disadvantage would become irrelevant. This logic was not entirely irrational. There were moments in the history of warfare when a technological breakthrough had indeed overturned what seemed like an insurmountable advantage. But the V-weapons, as they were actually deployed, proved not to be those breakthroughs. They were militarily significant enough to demand a substantial Allied effort to counter and suppress, but they were not sufficient to alter the fundamental trajectory of the war. Another was the faith in Allied political fracture. The coalition arrayed against Germany, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union was, from a certain angle, an improbable one. The ideological differences between liberal democracy and Soviet communism were profound. The strategic interests of Britain and America did not always align. There were moments when German diplomatic intelligence identified genuine tensions within the alliance. Hitler returned to these repeatedly, apparently believing until quite late that some combination of political pressure, military success, and diplomatic maneuvering could pry the coalition apart. If that happened, American production would not matter, or would matter less, because the military demands on it would fragment. The German intelligence assessors who wrote the industrial analyses occupied an uncomfortable position in this environment. Their job was to describe reality accurately. Reality was that American industry was producing military material at rates that, combined with British and Soviet production, meant that the Axis would face an ever-growing material imbalance for as long as the war continued. To say this clearly, in writing, with documented figures, was to produce documents that could not easily be reconciled with the official optimism that the regime required for its own internal functioning. Some of these assessors appear to have resolved this tension by presenting the numbers accurately, while framing their implications cautiously, describing trends and trajectories rather than drawing explicit conclusions about the war's likely outcome. Others, particularly as the war continued and the evidence became overwhelming, produced assessments that were remarkably frank in their pessimism, at least internally. The Speer Ministry's own analyses from 1944 onward show an institution that had, at the working level, largely abandoned the belief that the production gap could be closed. What Germany never produced, what the system was structurally incapable of producing, was a clear-eyed assessment that reached the top of the decision-making hierarchy, was fully accepted there, and translated into a corresponding strategic adjustment. The political system did not permit it. The information existed, the analysis existed, but between analysis and action lay a gap that the nature of the Nazi state had made, in practice, uncrossable. Despite the increasingly clear evidence that American industrial output could not be matched, German strategic planning did not simply collapse into passivity. There were serious, sustained efforts to find some way to neutralize the advantage, to to cut off American production before it reached the European theater, or to develop some technical or strategic leverage that would change the terms of the competition. The most significant of these efforts was the U-boat campaign, and it deserves examination in some detail precisely because it came closer to working, or to threatening to work, than any other German counter-strategy. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded the German submarine arm and later became commander-in-chief of the German Navy, had developed before the war a coherent theory of how submarines could defeat a maritime power. The theory was not about sinking warships. It was about strangling the logistical chain that connected American industry to the European and North African theaters of war. If submarines could sink merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced, and if they could sink oil tankers in sufficient numbers to create fuel shortages, the American military machine would be unable to deliver its output to where it was needed. The factories would continue to produce, but their products would accumulate in ports and depots rather than reaching the front. In the first 8 months of 1942, this theory came alarmingly close to practical demonstration. American anti-submarine doctrine and equipment were in their early stages of development. American coastal shipping proceeded in peacetime patterns, without convoys, without consistent air cover, with navigational lighting still burning along the coast. German submarines, operating in American coastal waters in what their crews called the happy time or the second happy time, achieved a rate of sinkings that, had it been sustained, would indeed have created severe logistical strain. It was not sustained. The reasons are worth understanding because they illuminate the same fundamental problem that faced every German counter-strategy. American productive capacity was ultimately not a fixed target, but an expanding one. The Allied response to the U-boat threat was itself an exercise in mass production and organizational improvisation. Escort vessels, destroyers, frigates, destroyer escorts were built in the same quantities and by the same methods as everything else, designed to a good enough standard and then manufactured in the largest possible numbers. Long-range patrol aircraft, equipped with radar and improved weapons, were produced and deployed over the Atlantic convoy lanes. The research and development effort devoted to anti-submarine warfare by British and American scientists was enormous, producing rapid improvements in detection equipment, attack weapons, and tactical doctrine. By mid-1943, the balance in the Atlantic had decisively shifted. U-boat losses reached unsustainable levels. Dönitz was forced to pull his submarines from the main convoy routes. The threat remained throughout the war, but it never again achieved the crisis conditions of 1942. The production data tells the story with particular clarity. At the height of the 1942 crisis, Germany was sinking Allied merchant tonnage faster than new ships were being delivered. By 1943, American and British yards were delivering new tonnage at more than twice the rate of losses. The gap continued to widen. Even if German submarine performance had remained constant, which it did not, as Allied countermeasures improved, the arithmetic would have eventually overwhelmed the campaign. Germany also placed extraordinary faith in the potential of strategic air power to interdict American supply. This took two forms. The first was the hope that the Luftwaffe might find some way to strike at American production directly, a hope that remained, for geographic reasons already discussed, essentially theoretical. The second was the related hope that German defenses might be able to inflict sufficient losses on Allied strategic bombers to make their campaign against German industry unsustainable. In this second ambition, Germany came much closer to success than is sometimes acknowledged. The early years of the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany were extraordinarily costly for the attackers. In the famous Schweinfurt raids of 1943, attacking American bombers, B-17s and B-24s, were sent deep into Germany without fighter escort, and German interceptors inflicted losses that approached 60 aircraft in a single mission. These were losses that no air force could sustain indefinitely. The American 8th Air Force was, for a period in late 1943, genuinely close to a crisis of sustainability. And then the P-51 Mustang arrived. The North American P-51 Mustang, equipped with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and fitted with external fuel tanks, could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was also, by any measure, one of the finest fighter aircraft of the war, fast, maneuverable, and with sufficient range to meet and destroy the German interceptors wherever they rose to defend. The story of its engine is itself a small encapsulation of the Allied industrial collaboration that Germany could not match. The Merlin was a British design, developed by Rolls-Royce in Derby, England, and fitted to the Spitfire and Hurricane that had defended Britain in 1940. When American production of the Mustang demanded engines in quantities that Rolls-Royce alone could not supply, the American automobile manufacturer Packard, a company whose peacetime business was producing luxury cars, took the Merlin design, tooled its factories to build it, and began manufacturing British Aero engines in Detroit. At its peak, Packard was producing Merlin engines in numbers that rivaled Rolls-Royce's own output. A British design, manufactured by an American car company, powering an American aircraft to protect American bombers over German cities. It was a collaboration so practically effective, so unsentimental in its industrial logic, that it serves almost as a symbol of everything the Axis powers could not replicate. The introduction of the Mustang as a long-range escort fighter in the first months of 1944 transformed the strategic bombing campaign. The Luftwaffe could no longer effectively defend its own skies. The attrition shifted from the bombers to the interceptors. German oil production, under sustained attack, began to collapse. By mid-1944, German aircraft were being built faster than pilots could be trained and fuel could be provided to fly them. This, too, was ultimately a production story. The P-51 was itself a product of American industrial capacity, designed, produced, and modified at a pace that the German aviation industry could not match. The Merlin engines that powered it were being manufactured in large numbers on both sides of the Atlantic by both Rolls-Royce and its American licensee Packard. The fuel tanks that gave it its range were a logistical innovation, simple and mass-produced. The Mustang was not a miracle. It was the product of a system that could rapidly identify problems and resource solutions to them at industrial scale. Germany's technological gambits, the jet aircraft, the advanced submarines of the type the 21st class, the ballistic missiles, were all genuine achievements of engineering. The Me-262 jet fighter was fast enough to be nearly untouchable in level flight. The type the 21st submarine was a genuinely revolutionary design, capable of sustained high-speed underwater operation that would have made the earlier Allied countermeasures far less effective. The V-2 could not be intercepted, but none of these came in sufficient numbers, in time. Production, always production, was the limiting factor. The type the 21st entered operational service too late to affect the Battle of the Atlantic. The Me-262 was produced in numbers too small to influence the air war. The V-2 was extraordinarily expensive per unit of destructive effect delivered and consumed resources that could have produced more conventionally effective weapons. The German assessment teams, reviewing the technological programs alongside the production data, appear to have understood this dynamic with painful clarity. The innovations were real. The time was gone. There is a question that historians have returned to many times, and which the German assessments themselves circle around without ever quite landing on directly. At what point did the German leadership, not just the intelligence analysts, not just the economists, but the men who actually directed the war, accept that the war was unwinnable? The answer is complicated by the nature of the regime, by the distinction between private conviction and public statement, and by the extraordinary capacity of the human mind to hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously when the alternative, full acceptance of catastrophic failure, is too terrible to contemplate. At the level of the professional economic and industrial analysts, the conclusion appears to have formed with considerable clarity by sometime in mid-1943. The combination of Stalingrad, the collapse of the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, and the verified American production figures for 1942, which, when assembled into a coherent picture, showed a trajectory that could only end one way, produced in the working-level assessors something very close to certainty. Their internal documents from this period are marked by a quality of controlled despair, precise, professional, honest, and deeply pessimistic. Albert Speer, in his post-war account, placed his own private recognition somewhat later, perhaps in late 1943 or early 1944, though he was careful to maintain a public posture of confidence for much longer than that. The generals of the Wehrmacht's operations staff present a complex picture. There were officers who privately believed the war was lost well before its end, who continued to plan and fight with professional thoroughness, not because they believed in victory, but because it was what soldiers do, and because the political system offered no legitimate alternative. There were also officers who maintained genuine belief in some form of acceptable outcome much longer. Hitler himself is the most difficult to assess. The historical record suggests a man who oscillated, who could be startlingly clear-eyed about the material situation in some conversations, and yet maintain, in others, a conviction that some combination of miracle, political shift, and will could still change the outcome. Whether this oscillation represented genuine belief, or was itself a kind of psychological defense mechanism, a way of continuing to function under conditions that would have destroyed a man capable of fully accepting them, is a question that historians and psychologists have debated for decades without resolution. What the German assessments of American industry contributed to this picture was not a single decisive moment of clarity. They contributed instead an accumulation, a weight of evidence that, over months and years, pressed down on the German strategic calculation with increasing force. Each new quarter's production figures, verified by multiple intelligence channels, cross-referenced against shipping data and procurement records and the testimony of neutral observers, added another layer to the burden. The trajectory was consistent. The gap was widening. The Americans were building faster, further ahead, and with no sign of the industrial or political fatigue that German hopes had counted on. There was, in the final analysis, no single document that represented the definitive German assessment of American industry. There was no moment when a minister placed a report on a desk and a decision was made. There was instead a slow, relentless accumulation of certainty that moved through the German system like a tide, penetrating first the analytical levels, then the operational planners, then the senior military commanders, finally reaching, in some form, even the political leadership at the apex. By the time it had fully permeated the system, there was nothing left to do with the knowledge except continue. The war, as a result, was fought to its absolute end, not because the Germans expected to win, but because the political and institutional structures of the Nazi state offered no mechanism for the translation of strategic assessment into political decision. The men who knew did not have the power to stop it. The men who had the power would not fully accept what the knowing men told them, or could not bring themselves to act on it if they did. It was, in its way, one of the most consequential failures of organizational intelligence in the history of modern warfare. In the long history of the Second World War, certain things have come to stand for the conflict in the popular imagination. The beaches of Normandy, the spires of smoke over burning cities, the faces of soldiers in the photographs that have survived the decades. These are the visible things. They are real and they matter. But beneath them, prior to them, enabling them, making them possible, was something that moved too slowly and too massively to be captured in a single image. It moved in the night shifts at the Willow Run bomber plant outside Detroit, where B-24 Liberators emerged from an assembly line inside a building that covered more ground than any building had ever covered before. It moved on the slipways of Kaiser's shipyards in Richmond, California, where a Liberty ship was launched every few days with a regularity that a few years earlier would have seemed like madness. It moved in the oil fields of Texas, in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, in the aluminum smelters of the Pacific Northwest, powered by hydroelectric dams, whose construction had itself been a monument to American organizational capacity. The German assessors who compiled the production figures, the ones that arrived on desks in Berlin and caused moments of prolonged, heavy silence, were looking at the output of something that had no precise historical equivalent. The American industrial system in wartime was not simply a large factory. It was a civilization that had discovered, in the crisis of the war, what it was capable of when it turned its full attention and energy toward a single defined purpose. The American soldiers who fought in North Africa, in Italy, in the Pacific, in France, in the Philippines, they were not individually more courageous or more skilled than their opponents. Their victory was not ordained by destiny or by any abstract quality of national character. It was built, in a very literal sense, on factory floors by people whose names do not appear in the histories, the women who assembled cockpit instruments, the men who poured the steel, the engineers who stayed up nights redesigning a component to make it easier to manufacture, the foremen who kept the line moving, the truck drivers who kept the supply depots stocked. They were all soldiers in this war, and their weapon was production itself. When Germany finally confronted the full scale of what it had taken on, when the figures were assembled, and the trajectories were clear, and the implications could no longer be deferred, it was already too late for that knowledge to matter strategically. The assessors had done their work. The analysis was correct. But the machinery of the Nazi state, having been built for aggression and conquest, had no provision for the kind of rational strategic withdrawal that the situation might, in a different political system, have eventually produced. It could only continue, and the American factories continued too, and the gap continued to grow. There is a particular weight to this story that resists easy resolution. It is not simply the story of American triumph, though there is triumph in it. It is the story of what happens when two fundamentally different approaches to the organization of human productive effort meet in the most extreme possible test. The German approach, precise, skilled, technically brilliant, but inflexible and ultimately incapable of scaling to the demands of a total war, met the American approach, standardized, adaptable, designed from the outset for mass rather than perfection. And the result was determined not on the battlefield, but in the arithmetic of industrial output. The officers who read those reports in Berlin, who sat with the figures in front of them and felt the weight of what they meant, were not defeated in those moments. They had already been defeated by something that had been building for years before